Well, I didn't plan on addressing this topic since it's a bit outside my wheelhouse. I tend to deal with, of course, foreign policy news and the economy. However, this recent flare-up between the Knickers and Conservatism Inc. is just too interesting from I guess, a political standpoint for me to ignore. I really think that this is not a turning point, but an interesting anecdote in the ongoing battle within the conservative movement that most people, typical talk radio listeners or people who, I guess now the modern equivalent would be, guys in their 30s who listen to Ben Shapiro or, somebody like that. This kind of conflict is not something that most people are aware of. It's something that's sort of always been bubbling under the surface. And I'll get more into the history of that later and tie it into what's going on now. But basically, for those of you who don't know, Nick Fuentes, who is a YouTuber, does a show every night at 8. And he's built up a bit of a following for himself, certainly a lot more than a following than I've got. He's got, I think 50,000 subscribers or something. So a decent channel. He has a nice, sizable platform. He has, no overhead. I think he just does his show from his apartment or whatever, with a green screen. And so he's had, I guess, the liberty to develop his own ideas free of any sort of donor influence, like, say, a lot of the people in the conservative media would have to deal with, because when you're trying to get hired by, let's say, a newspaper like the Washington Examiner or a website like the Daily Wire, you have to be conscious of whatever your employer's editorial standings are, and you want to make sure that you don't want to come too much into conflict with those, or else you really won't have a place left at that publication. You'll, kind of just be shown the door because you don't share their ideology. And with the rise of the internet, there has been this space created for people, not only like Nick Fuentes, but other people like, Tim Pool and Sargon of Akkad or Mr. Mediocre, or, just people who don't have to, abide by the standards set by, an editor. They are essentially able to deliver their opinions unfiltered. And what has ended up happening in Nick's life is that, he's sort of evolved in a direction that's sort of divergent from where the mainstream of the conservative movement is, where he's not quite in line with official conservatism, or Conservatism Incorporated, as many of us like to call it. Nick has shifted into, what's known as paleoconservatism, which is, the ideology of people like Patrick J. Buchanan and the great Paul Gottfried, two men who I quite admire, even though I don't really share a lot of their ideas. Now, these two men haven't had much of an impact on, Generation Z or the millennials, because both of them are quite old by this point. They're both, I think it's safe to say that they're elderly, and their paleoconservative ideas haven't really seen the light of day thanks to, the suppression by, Conservatism Inc. They didn't really have much of a place. There's the American Conservative Magazine, and that's about it. However, Mr. Nick Fuentes, with his, his young, sort of Zoomer style, and his slick back hair, and his YouTube channel, has been able to serve as a conduit for these ideas into the minds of, people who are our age. And so that has led to, I guess, the creation of a bit of a rift within, your college conservative folks. There are a lot of people, certainly a lot more than there were, 10 or 15 years ago, that are mine and Nick's age, that are questioning the orthodoxy of Conservatism Incorporated, that are, starting to think critically and wonder if there might be some contradictions inherent in their dogma. And that's what led to the display that we saw earlier this week, and, I guess, that'll continue as long as Charlie Kirk is the head of Turning Point USA, a sentinel of Conservatism Incorporated. He's currently on what he's calling his culture war tour, where he's going around to a bunch of college campuses, giving a stump speech and then taking questions. And what ended up happening was some Nickers, as they call themselves, fans of Nick Fuentes, decided to go up to Charlie at one of his events and ask him some uncomfortable questions. Why are they uncomfortable? Well, they're uncomfortable because when people like Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro or Michael Knowles, I think, does these too, where they do these speeches and then they do a Q&A, what they're trying to do is they're farming for clips that they can post on YouTube and get a bunch of clicks. They want some, dumb college leftist who's not very intelligent to come up and make a dumb point, and then they want to smack them down and tell them how wrong they are, and then the audience claps, and then they post it on YouTube, and then everyone on Facebook can share it around and say, haha, look how dumb college kids are. That's the point of these Q&As. What they don't want happening is for someone who is also, considers themselves conservative but happens to have some disagreements with them to come up and say, hey, Charlie, isn't what you're saying, kind of not very conservative? And then Charlie has to defend himself, from the right. That's not what they're looking for, because those clips don't do well, because then Charlie's playing defense. He can't go on offense then, because it turns out that, a lot of these people on the right are not intellectually consistent. They've had to compromise a lot of their ideas, and they support ideas that don't necessarily mesh well together because, by the nature of their business model, they have to serve a donor class that has varying different ideas and different interests. Conservatism Inc. is propped up by an amalgamation of moneyed interests. So therefore, based on that business model, in order to rise in Conservatism Incorporated, what one needs is not necessarily to be the most intelligent or informed ideologue, or the best speaker, or the most compelling advocate of your ideas. What you need to be is the most compelling and convincing advocate of your donors' ideas. Because no matter how smart you are, or how well thought your arguments are, or how good of a speaker you are, if you don't have donors who are willing to give you a platform in which to present your case, you really are nothing in Conservatism Inc. And so therefore, the people in this whole, conservative media complex, or the conservative industrial complex, let's call it, oftentimes work themselves into pretzels by trying to, adhere to an orthodoxy set by, all these different donor groups and all these different interest groups that fund them, so that they can make sure that they attract funds from, the broadest pool of people possible. They want to make themselves as attractive as possible to the donor class and to the editors of the publications who rely on these donors. And so in doing so, they compromise intellectual honesty and ideological purity. And so the knickers, by going, remember YouTube, I'm not saying the bad N-word, I'm just saying Nick, E-R-S, the fans of Nick. The knickers are able to go to these turning point events and ask rather straightforward questions to somebody like Charlie Kirk, a sentinel of Conservatism Incorporated, and he gets quite upset because they are pointing out, legitimate points, issues that someone from, a conservative perspective might have with, the policy positions of Mr. Charlie Kirk. And so this presents a much greater, threat to Conservatism Inc. than, say, a college socialist coming up and debating them, because in reality, Kirk is not at liberty to debate openly with someone like Nick Fuentes or any of his fans who happen to share different views than he does, because either he will be humiliated for having to twist himself into a pretzel to, stick by, mainstream conservative orthodoxy, or he will end up pissing off his donors by, making an intellectually honest point. Because when you look at the ideology of Conservatism Inc. as a whole, it's not really an ideology that is, held by any real person, because if you look at the things they advocate, they're essentially left libertarians when it comes to the domestic sphere, when it comes to social issues, when it comes to domestic government policy, and they are neoconservatives when it comes to foreign policy. I would argue that this has never happened in the wild. A person who is very passionately advocates a neoconservative foreign policy and a left libertarian, outright libertine domestic policy, a policy by which you not only advocate for the rights of people who would be considered sexual deviants, such as homosexuals and bisexuals and the transgender folks and all the alphabet soup people. Because Charlie Kirk not only wants those people to be free to express themselves in that way or whatever, and live without having to fear, for government retribution, but he also advocates that ordinary Americans, and not only Americans in general, but the conservative movement itself, embrace these people and extol the virtues of their sexual deviancy. And in fact, he goes so far as to say that these things that are in and of themselves conservative. They are fundamental bedrock conservative principles. Something that within my lifetime, and I'm a very young man, was considered to be heinous and disgusting by mainstream conservatives only a few years ago. Those now are a part of fundamental bedrock conservative principles. That just doesn't make sense, and no one who is an honest person thinks that way. No one could say that with a straight face if they were someone who was speaking from their heart or was being intellectually honest. The only reason why Conservatism Inc. has shifted so far culturally left is because of, purely cynical reasons, because they feel like that's where the money is. They see no gain in pretending to be, social conservatives anymore. However, they don't want to give up the conservative label, so therefore they must make libertinism conservative. Now, for Nick and his knickers, this might seem like a relatively new phenomenon, something that is rather novel, or perhaps, well, Nick probably knows better than this, but for most of his fans, they probably look at this and genuinely scratch their heads and wonder, gee, why would the mainstream of the conservative movement, suddenly shift like this? And why would they advocate these seemingly contradictory policies? Why, another issue they harped on was Israel, why would Charlie not feel comfortable saying that, if tomorrow, the president could sign a law that would unambiguously help the United States but, might hurt Israel, do you think that's, would you sign that if you were president? And, Charlie had trouble answering that question. He got quite upset. People who, look at him and think that he's a real person would wonder, hey, if Charlie, you say you put America first, how is that a hard question? That's a softball. That's literally, the question is just a reworded version of, do you put America before all other countries? But that's not a softball for someone like Charlie Kirk, because someone like Charlie Kirk is not a real person. He's not a thinking person. He might have his own personal thoughts deep down, but as far as his public persona goes, he is nothing more than a performance actor. He's not a real, thinker. He's not a political mind of any sort. Charlie's just an avatar of, a set of ideas that happens to be favorable amongst the donor class. Now, I've gotten bogged down in the details of what exactly has been going on this week, but I teased at the beginning that this conflict between, Nick Fuentes and Conservatism Inc. Is really just the latest episode in an ongoing conflict that's been, bubbling under the surface of the conservative movement for decades. And that conflict, the way I see it, began after the Second World War, when you had I guess most notably, CIA agent William F. Buckley Jr. Start his infamous magazine, The National Review, which still exists today for some reason. I guess some people still subscribe to it. And he tried to, the general historiography, the mainstream story of what Buckley did in his life was consolidate the conservative movement after World War II into a cohesive movement, that ultimately culminated in the 1964 presidential election, in which Barry Goldwater was nominated and lost, and we don't need to get into all that. But basically, people think of as Buckley as the great unifier. He was the figurehead of the conservative movement that gave it legs. When in reality, Buckley did quite the opposite. He kneecapped the conservative movement. It's not like that the conservatives were, an amorphous mass before World War II, and that they they really were dysfunctional and didn't work and had no ideas or whatever, and no coherent ideology. Quite the opposite. The old right was quite vibrant. What Buckley did was divide the conservative movement. He decided that he was going to be sort of the arbiter of who is and is not a real conservative, and he pretty much blackballed anyone that he disagreed with and didn't share his views. Most importantly, people who didn't share his views on foreign policy. Folks who didn't think that it was necessarily America's duty to be the world police. People who didn't support the idea, to use Buckley's words, of creating a totalitarian state inside of America to defeat the totalitarian state of the Soviet Union. It was some analogy or some term like that was what Buckley said. He essentially said that the duty of the conservative movement, first and foremost, is to defeat communism. And so therefore, to do that, we're going to have to blow up these great giant state. And we're going to need to give the federal government, plenipotentiary powers, and we're going to need to go all around the world and fight all these wars, and we're going to need to overthrow governments in South America and Southeast Asia. And believe it or not, at the time, there were a lot of conservatives who thought that this was absolutely a disastrous, horrible idea. In fact, what was the mainstream of conservatism before the Second World War, thought that way. They were non-interventionists. They were people who did not want to get involved outside the world. They were people who only wanted to focus on America. They didn't want to focus on this global world order. They hated Woodrow Wilson, for example, and they hated, Franklin Roosevelt. In other words, the conservative movement, before World War II, were essentially enemies of the post-World War II American state. They were enemies of the CIA and of the intelligence community. They were enemies of the military-industrial complex. They were enemies of the moneyed interests that now fund Conservatism Incorporated. In short, Conservatism Inc. was born to suppress true American conservative thought. It was born to suppress intellectual honesty and, real ideas on the right. That's why, if you look in the universities, you really don't have any conservative intellectuals. Sure, there might be some intellectuals who are Republicans, registered Republicans and might vote Republican, but none of them are really conservatives. You don't have, conservative scholars. You don't have conservative philosophers, really. There's only a handful compared to the left. Why is that? Well, because when you have conservatives who think deeply and come up with a cohesive, ideology, they don't often happen to land on supporting this strange amalgamation of policies that Conservatism Inc. stands for. To use an example, fiscal responsibility and the idea of cutting taxes or trying to reduce the government debt doesn't really go along with, say, massive amounts of foreign aid and endless wars in the Middle East. Those two things don't really go together. Someone who cares about one thing usually isn't going to care about the other. Or, in fact, they might think that the other thing is a bad thing. If you want endless wars, you don't want to cut the deficit. You probably don't want to cut taxes. You want as much money flowing into your wars as possible. And likewise, if you're someone who cares about balancing the budget, you're not going to want to invade Iraq. So therefore, the core ideas, the most important sort of policy positions that are touted most by Conservative Inc. Just contradict themselves. So to bring it back into what's going on this week, what you're witnessing really is not a legitimate outrage, certainly, at the terrible ideas of Nicholas J. Fuentes and a bunch of people who suddenly discovered him and had never heard of him now saying, "Oh my gosh, you're so horrible, I disavow you." You never see them do that when it comes to leftist communists. who advocate for gulags. You never see this kind of revulsion. You never see people calling into Seb Gorka's radio show saying that Noam Chomsky should gargle razor blades, yet you are hearing people say that about Nick Fuentes. And that's because this is an example of what I've been talking about, of Conservatism Inc. having to smother legitimate right-wing thought in America, whether you agree with it or not. And, people who follow this channel regularly, might have gathered by now that, I'm not one of those people. I'm not a paleocon. However, I have much more respect for paleocons than I do, neocons or mainstream conservatism, or conservative media, because they actually think. They have real opinions. You can engage with them. They are human beings. And I think that they are on the ascendance, even though they're still very, very small right now. I think that, like libertarians, 10 years ago, the paleocons are ascending right now because the gatekeepers in Conservatism Inc. are no longer able to hold back the dissidents. They don't have the power that they used to. People like, Nick Fuentes don't need all the donor money. He has a YouTube channel. That fact alone allows him to stand up against, official conservatism. And that's why, of course, you heard Seb Gorka and all these other people advocating for him to be banned from both Twitter and YouTube. Not because they think his ideas are so nasty, because obviously there's lots of nasty ideas on Twitter and YouTube. Again, just look to the left. Look at, out-and-out Maoists that have YouTube channels and Twitter accounts. Yet they're not calling for them to be banned because they aren't a threat. The reason why they want to deplatform people on the right who say no words and who have different ideas outside of the mainstream is because that will give them their gatekeeping power back. It will once again give them the ability to control right-wing thought in America and to steer Americans who are, Republicans or people or independents that are right-leaning in the direction that they want towards their ideas, so that they can continue to keep brainwashing people into thinking that you have to be, a supporter of Israel to be a patriotic American, even though those two things don't go together. Obviously you can be a good American and still like Israel, but it doesn't make any sense that, you have to be a fan of Israel to, be a good American. I mean, we wouldn't say that about any other American ally. You wouldn't say that, you have to love Britain to be a great American. You have to love France to be a great American. You have to love Japan to be a great American. But of course, these are things you're not supposed to notice. You're not supposed to point this out. You're not supposed to Google dancing Israelis. You're not allowed to do that. And so on that note, I guess I'll sign off here. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.